Good evening and welcome to the new BUGAJSKI Hour from Washington, D.C. I would like to thank Voice of America for hosting the Washington episodes of my show for RTK. And today I will be discussing important questions with a major policy analyst. And our guest on the BUGAJSKI hot seat is Dan Serwer, a highly respected U.S. policy advisor, as well as professor of conflict management at the Center for Transatlantic Relations at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. But first, my political commentary on an important international topic is entitled Russia's Terrorist Coalitions. Russia is not a reliable partner for the West against international terrorism. On the contrary, Moscow remains closely linked with violent jihadism as a means for undermining the West and expanding its influences. Following the Paris terrorist attacks, proposals have been offered for a so-called grand bargain with Russia to combat the Islamic State IS. In return for allowing Moscow to pursue its ambitions throughout the former Soviet Union, the Kremlin will provide support in combating the IS. In practice, such a plan would surrender Ukraine, Georgia, and other states to Kremlin control without any tangible benefits for the West. In reality, Russia itself acts as a terrorist state for two reasons. The regime has engaged in terrorist attacks against its own population, and it has played a key role in developing terrorist networks outside of its borders. The Putinists have engaged in domestic terrorism to manipulate the public. According to some Western specialists, the most notorious outrage occurred in 1999, shortly after Putin was appointed president. The FSB, formerly the KGB, reportedly bombed several housing complexes inside Russia, killing over 300 citizens, while blaming it on so-called Chechen terrorists in order to justify a new war against Chechnya's independence. Moscow has also engaged in the assassinations of critics and defectors. In July 2006, Russia actually introduced legislation enabling, quote, Russian special units to kill extremists outside of Russia, unquote. Moscow's definition of extremism includes all critics of the Putin regime. Connections between the Kremlin and international terrorism extend back for decades. The KGB helped to develop modern terrorism against Israeli and Western targets. It provided weapons to several Palestinian terrorist groups, including Hezbollah, and first devised aircraft hijackings during the 1960s. The KGB deployed terrorism to spread communist regimes around the world before Islamist terrorism became a global threat. In fact, Islamist jihadism and the birth of Al-Qaeda were sparked by Russia's invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, as well as the destruction of independent Chechnya after 1999. The FSB continues the tradition of sponsoring terrorism. During its proxy attack on Ukraine, Moscow supplied the missile system to separatists who shot down a Malaysian airplane and killed nearly 300 civilians. All evidence demonstrates that Russia continues to fuel the war within Ukraine, both by direct intervention and by supporting the separatists. In Syria, Russia's airstrikes have not been directed primarily against the IS jihadists, but against opposition forces supported by the West and by Turkey. Putin's primary objective has been to prop up the regime of President Bashar al-Assad in Damascus, and thereby guarantee Russia's ongoing military and intelligence presence in the region. The largest number of IS militants are actually being recruited inside Russia, especially as the FSB has encouraged local Islamists to travel to Syria and Iraq on the assumption that this will reduce insurgencies in the North Caucasus. Nonetheless, this policy will come back to haunt Moscow when the militants return to Russia with more experience, weaponry, and networks. It is time not only to conduct a thorough investigation of Moscow's terrorist connections and activities, but also to take steps to define the Putinist regime both as a sponsor and perpetrator of domestic and international terrorism. This will deepen the ostracism and isolation of a system that relies on deception and mass murder to achieve its goals, regardless of its current ideology. Okay, it is time now for the Bugajski Hot Seat with our special guest, Dan Serwer. Dan is Professor of Conflict Management at the Center for Transatlantic Relations at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies here in Washington, D.C. He's also a long-time Balkan analyst, policy analyst and advisor, and very well respected in Washington. So thank you very much for joining me on the show for RTK at VOA.
My pleasure, Janusz.
A lot of ground to cover, but let me begin with a sort of broader picture in the Western Balkans, and then we'll zero in more on Kosovo. Let us first of all start with the positive. Since the breakup of Yugoslavia, what would you say have been the achievements in the region?
Well, the big achievement is that peace prevails in the region, and some degree of democracy also prevails in the region. Parts of the region have made some very real economic progress. Certainly I'd count Macedonia until very recently in that category, Croatia. Other countries have done less well, frankly. Bosnia, Serbia have done less well. But the overall picture, and here I find it hard sometimes to convince people because they're so down on the Balkans. But the fact is that things are a hell of a lot better than they were in the fall of 1994 when I first landed in Sarajevo and got fired at as my plane was landing.
Now you're greeted with flowers rather than bullets.
I'm not really greeted with flowers. I'm going to Sarajevo tomorrow for the first time in a couple of years. I expect to be greeted by taxi cabs and normal services and houses that have been rebuilt, and that's all to the better.
And in terms of achievements in international integration, maybe you could sort of explain to our viewership how that has progressed.
It's really quite remarkable that Slovenia and Croatia are already members of the EU, Croatia, Albania, members of NATO, Macedonia, not a member of NATO only because of a ridiculous issue about its name with Greece. This is enormous progress in terms of integration with Euro-Atlantic structures. And it's a progress that was not anticipated 20 years ago in 1995. The first real indication that these countries would become members of the European Union was at the Sarajevo summit in 1999 with the advent of the Regional Stability Pact. That was the real meaning of the Stability Pact. And really, it's not very many years since 1999, since Thessaloniki, and the commitment by Europe to accept these countries once they qualify.
Do you think this process will continue? I mean, there are some voices that say after Croatia things are going to slow down. It's going to be a few years before any other country qualifies.
Things are certainly going to slow down because Europe has its own internal difficulties. It now has this tremendous problem of the migrants or refugees, depending on whom you're talking about and who's talking about them, from the Middle East, from North Africa. So it's certainly going to slow down, but frankly none of the countries of the region are ready at this point either. The trick here is that you gain most of the benefits of EU membership, most of the very concrete benefits at the beginning of the process, not only at the end, but at the very beginning of the process. And at the end of the process, it's not just that you have to prove yourself qualified, and that's harder than ever it was before. It gets harder with every enlargement. You not only have to prove yourself qualified, but the political conditions inside the Union have to be ready for you. And there's no predicting when that will happen. Sure. So the right strategy is get ready and wait for the window to open.
Let me look now at some of the negatives. as you know, in recent months, several West Balkan states have experienced some turmoil, whether protests against government abuses in Macedonia, protests against alleged government corruption in Montenegro, disruption of the Kosovo parliament and the street skirmishes and so forth, the rest of the opposition. Are these events related in any way? Are there any common threads, would you say, in these events?
Well, are they related? I mean, there are some common threads in some of them. I have no doubt that the Russian hand is
I was going to come to that.
encouraging
Right.
things in Montenegro, in Macedonia, but that's certainly not true of the demonstrations in Kosovo, for example. So I wouldn't say that there's a single common thread here. The truth of the matter is that in all democratic societies, including those that have not completed the transition, you have fundamental disagreements over the future of the country, over corruption, over what obligations the country should or should not take on. And there's nothing wrong with having demonstrations. We've got them every day in the United States. And there's nothing wrong with having corruption trials. It's a good sign when you're having those, not a bad sign. This kind of turmoil is what democracies are built for. And if they're full-fledged democracies, they don't threaten the fundamental constitutional structure. But in transition societies, they can represent more serious threats to the basic constitutional structure.
Well, for example, in the case of Kosovo, which has been the disruption of parliamentary legislative work, undermining, let's say, the functioning of institutions, would you say that's a normal process, or is that goes against the democratization?
Well, it happens in other countries. I wouldn't say it's part of the normal process. It's rather unusual. And frankly, in my way of thinking, also deplorable. And I'm not saying that the objectives of those who oppose the government in Kosovo shouldn't be listened to. I'm only saying that violent disruption of a democratic parliament is no way to institute change. And frankly, I think it'll lead to the parties that advocate and conduct it, I think it will lead to serious problems for them when the next elections come.
Does it sort of delegitimize institutions in the eyes of the public, would you say? Does it?
It's certainly, I'm not sure delegitimizes is the right word, but it certainly diminishes them in the eyes of the public and makes it harder to govern.
Would you say poverty, dissatisfaction with government, official corruption, nepotism and so forth, all the things that the region, and not only the region, but many other countries are prone to, would you say that sort of fosters social disquiet, turmoil, extra parliamentary opposition? Is there a danger that this could spill over into the streets?
I certainly think that corruption is an issue in quite a few countries of the region. In Romania, it already has spilled over into the streets, led to resignations of the government, led to a real change in the governing structure. Whether that will happen in Kosovo or in Montenegro, I can't tell. I think much less likely in Montenegro, because I think the Russian hand is active there. It's not an entirely indigenous movement. It's rather small demonstrations as well. In Kosovo, there are other issues, and the other issues are in part constitutional, because they have to do with whether Kosovo is free to choose union with Albania, for example, which is a choice that was ruled out by the international community in its constitution, and which the international community continues to feel strongly about, and some Kosovars don't like it.
Before we turn specifically to Kosovo, let me ask you sort of one bigger question, and I'll pose it this way. What are the remaining or outstanding challenges that the region faces over the next, let's say, 5 years? What is it that we should be focused on, that we should be trying to prevent?
Well, in the prevention category, I think radicalization of Muslims in the region is certainly a serious concern. But I would put very close to that, if not above it, the economic conditions in the region. There just has not been enough economic progress, and in particular for young people, unemployment in a number of countries is extraordinarily high, and that's very, I rank that as very delegitimizing for the governments of the region. But when it comes to goals, it's not only what you want to avoid, it's what you want to get. And it seems to me those countries that have done well have been very clear about wanting NATO membership and wanting European Union membership and being willing to make the serious sacrifices that are required to get those things. And, you know, I don't think there's anything in the region that absolutely blocks NATO or EU membership. You know, frankly, this region is too small to worry about in terms of enlargement. Enlargement to the Balkans is an enlargement of a few tens of millions. It's much, much smaller than enlargement to Turkey or the enlargement to Eastern Europe or to Ukraine.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a small region that would benefit enormously from full integration in the European Union, as much of it has already benefited on the security side from integration with NATO. I mean, it really is remarkable that Macedonian soldiers have fought integrated with the U.S. National Guard, U.S. Army in Afghanistan, that the armed forces in Bosnia have been unified in a way that preserves some of the ethnic character in museums and in symbols, but in fact creates a single unified armed force in a country where I thought it would take 40 years, 50 years to create such a thing. So we've seen some enormous progress where the political will has been present.
Would you say Kosovo also become a EU and NATO member, and if so, when?
Well, I certainly think Kosovo will become a NATO member if and when it can solve its problems with creating a real armed force. Yeah. It will build that armed force from scratch in compliance with NATO standards, in cooperation with NATO. I would anticipate that Kosovo's route to NATO could be blessedly short, other things being in place, especially some of the questions, the constitutional issues are being raised now about the North, about union with Albania. So if those are settled, I see really very little barrier between Kosovo and NATO membership. Kosovo and EU membership is a tougher road, and the reason is that EU membership requires a degree of implementation of the acquis communautaire. More standards that you know, frankly, Kosovo is not used to that level of governance. Sure. And so it's going to take a while for Kosovo to get ready for the EU. But as I said, the major benefits come early in the process, and the big benefits really come from adapting to the acquis communautaire, to adopting those standards and making your economy function like the European economies well before you become a formal member of the EU.
What about the countries that still refuse to recognize Kosovo? 4 in NATO, 5 in the EU. Would they block Kosovo's progress into both institutions?
If Kosovo were ready today, that would be a very, very serious problem, because I think at least Spain, considering its situation with Catalonia, would block Kosovo. I'm less sure that the others would block Kosovo, but Kosovo isn't ready today, and circumstances change. The Catalonia issue will, one way or another, be resolved someday, and frankly, the 4 others don't have as fundamental issues with Kosovo.
You think Cyprus doesn't?
I think you know, Cyprus is an interesting case because from my point of view, Cyprus non-recognition tends to encourage partition of Kosovo, and partition of Kosovo wouldn't stop with Kosovo. It would continue not only to Cyprus but to a number of other countries as well. So I think Cypriot opposition to recognizing Kosovo is self-defeating.
And in the case of the Greeks or the Slovaks and Romanians, that's presumably more likely to result in recognition once Kosovo begins to meet standards.
I think so. And frankly, there's a question of who's governing in some of those countries as well. So, but you know, I really don't think this is to worry about. Kosovo has rather good relations with these countries because, of course, it's trying very hard to have good relations with these countries, and that's what really counts.
Let's turn now to the internal situation in Kosovo. As you know, we've witnessed protest actions by the opposition coalition in Parliament, disrupting Parliament through tear gas and whistles and nerve gas and other, let's say, means of disrupting legislative work. The main opposition is to the agreement that Pristina has signed with Belgrade on the creation of this Zajednica, this Association of Serbian Municipalities. They question the whole process of negotiations anyway with Serbia. But what is your view of this agreement, this specific agreement? Their argument is that it will turn Kosovo into another Bosnia, that you're going to create another entity, which is going to mean a dysfunctional state, a bloc state, and there won't be any progress.
Look, I share the concerns about creating a two-entity Kosovo. Kosovo was blessed with a constitution that benefited from the relatively bad experience of the Bosnian constitution. And the Americans who were instrumental in all of this didn't write in all of the power-sharing arrangements that were written in from Kosovo. That has to do in part with the different demographics of Kosovo, but it also has to do with the fact that the Americans had realized that this was a pretty bad arrangement that had been made in Bosnia and Herzegovina. That said, Ahtisaari, in his wisdom, and I think he was very wise, included the Association of Serbian Municipalities with a pretty clear list of functions in his package. And it was on the basis of that package that Kosovo got international support for its independence. Now, this isn't fair, but life isn't fair. International affairs aren't fair. It isn't fair because what Ahtisaari was trying to do was to get Kosovo in recognition by Belgrade. And he included in the Ahtisaari package everything that Belgrade ever asked for, including this Association of Serbian Municipalities. Now, as it's turned out, the implementation of the rest of the Ahtisaari package has not been in any sense harmful to Kosovo. It's actually been quite beneficial. And I suspect that there are ways of implementing the Serbian Association of Municipalities, which is supposed to be subject to Kosovo law, in ways that will not be detrimental to the Kosovo state. And I think people should be careful about that. But to reject it entirely is to reject the basis on which Kosovo became independent. Now, for some of the protesters, in particular for Vetevnosje, that's perfectly fine because they don't agree with the way Kosovo became independent, and I see the consistency of their position. But I think for most Kosovars, and certainly for the international community, the message has to be, look, we don't like this, but it was in the package. We got to do it. We do it in a way that limits any damage to the Kosovo state.
But will the association mean territorial autonomy for Serbs? That, I think, is the key. Is it going to be administrative territorial autonomy, or is it going to be greater rights in to associate between relatively, let's say, decentralized structures within Kosovo?
It should be the latter. And I think there are reasons to hope that it will be the latter, because the interests of the various Serbian municipalities are really quite different, not only between those south of the Ibar and those north of the Ibar, but also between big ones like Mitrovica, which is not all Serbian, and some of the more Serbian communities, more rural communities. So I think there's good reason to believe that that the association will have its difficulties acting as a governing body, territorially autonomous. And I think there are probably ways that that the Kosovo Parliament can make sure that that doesn't happen. But it requires some care. This is the most difficult part of the Ahtisaari package for Albanian Kosovars to accept. And it's going to require some real tough political bargaining to make sure that it works in a way that isn't detrimental to the Kosovo state.
Do you think the opposition should be brought into the debate, seeing as they seem to reject the whole premise of the package, or should they be excluded? In other words, because the government
well,
is a
they should
majority.
certainly be brought into the debate, but it seems to me that they're refusing to be brought into the debate, and instead are standing on principle that they reject the Ahtisaari plan completely. They're entitled to reject the Ahtisaari plan completely. It's unusual in democratic societies to have extra constitutional political parties in parliament, even chairing committees in parliament. That's unusual, but it's done, and it's been done in Kosovo for a number of years quite successfully. The problem isn't, as I see it, with the majority, which would like to bring them in. The problem is that they don't want to be in, they want to be out. And they're using violent and really unacceptable methods to make their point.
Well, how do you assess the Brussels Accords more generally? I mean, which side has benefited more, Kosovo or Serbia, or both?
Well, you know, you'd have to go sort of checking each one, I suppose, and it's a process I've never really engaged in. It seems to me that the big picture is that Kosovo authorities have sat on an equal basis with Serbia's authorities, and have Serbia has accepted the legitimacy of the Kosovo Constitution on the whole territory of Kosovo. They've accepted the moral equivalent of customs posts. I think on balance, Brussels talks have been a big net positive for Kosovo statehood.
When will Serbia recognize Kosovo?
Sooner rather than later would be my answer. And there's a simple and concrete reason for this. It has to do with this armed forces question. The Kosovo authorities have to take very seriously today the possibility of a Serbian attack, at least to take the north, for example. If my nearest neighbor doesn't recognize me, doesn't exchange ambassadors with me, that means I have to worry about my national security. And I'd be the first to tell people in Pristina, look, you have to take this very seriously. This is one of the basic sovereign functions. You've been very good about being adaptable and flexible on other issues. You've adopted the euro as your currency. That eliminated a big sovereign issue. There are many other ways in which you've been flexible and adaptable in implementing the Ahtisaari plan. But on this, it seems to me you have to be very hard-nosed. If Serbia will not recognize and exchange ambassadors, you need to take the threat seriously. And taking the threat seriously means that you need to configure your forces in a way that could respond to a Serbian incursion. I don't think there's any real possibility of Serbs coming south of the Ibar, because they know that that would be catastrophic for the Serbian army. Even in the north, I'm not suggesting that Serbia is planning this, but I can picture circumstances in which protecting the Serbs of the north would become a big issue for Belgrade, an issue that would pressure some people who might come to power in Belgrade to do something about it. So you have to take that seriously. And that means a bigger, more capable force for Kosovo than if Serbia were to recognize and exchange ambassadors. So in my way of thinking, Serbia is quite properly concerned about how big and how powerful the Kosovo force will be. If it wants a smaller and less capable force, it should go talk to the Kosovars about that. And the Kosovars will say the same to the Serbs. We want to see you configuring your forces in a way which isn't a threat to us. And they can reach some kind of accommodation on mutual security. This is a normal process in neighboring countries, and it would be highly beneficial to both Serbia and Kosovo not to have to spend more money rather than less money on their security forces. So I would encourage, so far as I know, the chiefs of staff of the two countries have never met. If they have, it's in some multilateral forum where, you know, they may have nodded at each other. But they need a real relationship, and they need a relationship where there's some very clear understandings about what their forces are configured to do, what their war plans are.
Something that we, in other words, the United States could facilitate, I presume, in the coming years.
Yes, I would hope that the United States would consider facilitating that through NATO, perhaps. I'm not sure how best to get this done, but this is a missing keystone of the relationship between Kosovo and Serbia, the security relationship. Going
back to Serbia's progress towards the EU, is that ultimately contingent upon recognizing Kosovo as a state? Because you could have a situation, if Serbia were to enter the European Union, it could perpetually block Kosovo's membership in the future if it doesn't already recognize.
I think it's absolutely clear that Serbia will not become a member of the EU until it has recognized and exchanged ambassadors with Kosovo. And the reason for that isn't that I say it. It's that there are, I get my count wrong every once in a while, but I think there are 23 countries inside the European Union, any one of which can block, who recognize Kosovo, any one of which can block Serbia's EU membership. Sure. Now, you can imagine that 20 of those might get soft on Serbia and shrug their shoulders and say it doesn't really matter. But that ain't going to happen with the Dutch or with the Brits. And so I think, you know...
Regardless of government.
Regardless of government. And when I talk to Serbs about this, I say, well, nobody has ever said that our EU membership is conditional. Well, I know that it has been said, and not only by the Dutch and the Brits, but more importantly, it's perfectly obvious. It doesn't have to be said. It's perfectly obvious that the European Union is not going to take into its midst another Cyprus issue.
Turning to another question, which has been a factor in internal Kosovo politics, and this is the Special War Crimes Tribunal or court that's going to be established for Kosovo. Will it ultimately delegitimize the Kosovo Liberation Army, which is what some people in the country fear? Or will you think a clear distinction be made between individual abuses by individuals within the KLA against civilians, but without the, let's say, undermining the legitimacy of the wider movement, the wider guerrilla movement for Albanians?
Look, it's extraordinarily difficult for any country to hold its soldiers responsible for abuses. I mean, the United States preaches this all the time, that you have to do this. We're not very good about doing it ourselves. The truth of the matter is that it's very, rare that an American soldier is held responsible for abuses, and there are many instances of acquittals, of failure to prosecute, of all sorts of things. So, look, this is a difficult issue, inherently a difficult issue. But the best way to solve it, I think, is with international engagement. It's become quite clear that prosecution of higher level people in any of the Balkans countries is virtually impossible without international engagement. This hybrid tribunal idea is a hell of a lot better idea, in my view, than extending the jurisdiction of the ICTY or of the ICC. I mean, I don't think either the ICC or the ICTY have distinguished themselves in what they've been able to accomplish. But some of the more hybrid tribunals have been relatively successful. And it would seem to me that here, the only thing that delegitimizes the KLA is the current uncertainty about the charges against people who were associated with it. That's delegitimizing. But, you know, to have individuals held responsible for abuses, and there were certainly abuses. We all know that there was a virtual Albanian-on-Albanian civil war at the end of the '99 NATO-Yugoslavia war. So there were certainly Albanians killed after the war was ended, and there's no doubt there were Serbs killed as well. Let's put no gloss on it. It was quite apparent at the time. And the question is, who was responsible for that? And failure to answer that question is what delegitimizes the KLA.
And presumably there would be no immunity on parliamentary political grounds for any individual?
Presumably not. I actually am not sure of the exact legal arrangements at this point. But look, there can't be immunity and have the thing have any legitimacy.
Let me sort of look a little bit on a broader setting again at the region. One keeps hearing that the Balkans are a breeding ground for violent jihadism, for you know, the extremist Salafist anti-Western movements. To what degree is this an exaggeration? Is this a sort of Western prejudice about the region?
Well, it's an exaggeration in the sense of the absolute numbers. I mean, the absolute numbers of jihadis coming from the Balkans are pretty small, hundreds. In terms of percentages, they are not so small. And there are people studying this issue here in Washington who believe that the percentage from Kosovo, for example, is quite high compared to the population of youth in the country, for example. Bosnia, too, has been providing some jihadis to the cause in Syria and elsewhere. I think you have to take this seriously, but not let it displace the very real issues of corruption, economic stagnation, failure to put in place pretty good governance. I don't think you can allow it to displace those concerns because they are intimately related. You know, a country where governance is functioning well, you know, has jihadis. I mean, it has terrorists of all sorts. We just had what I would describe as a terrorist attack on an abortion clinic in the United States. I mean, you have terrorism incidents. In fact, the president has said, and it's objectively true, that we've had many more deaths from domestic terrorism than from international terrorism for many years. So you can't eliminate recruitment, you can't eliminate terrorism. There will always be the possibility of an attack, as has occurred in Bosnia, as occurred in Kosovo as well. But you can certainly reduce the likelihood of those things if people feel they're being governed well and if they're prospering.
Well, one occasionally reads these popular media accounts of Bosnia and Albania and Kosovo being allegedly Muslim countries that produce more terrorists, and this feeds into the stereotype of an unstable region that shouldn't really be part of European institutions. Do you see that sort of conflation of terrorism, criminality, corruption, keeping these countries out of the mainstream?
Well, I think they have to face up to that reputational risk, and I think it's an exaggeration to picture all of the people in these countries as somehow involved in corruption or terrorism or whatever. I mean, the fact of the matter is that Bosnian Muslims have traditionally been very moderate Muslims. There's been some inroad by more extremist Salafi elements since the war, but still most Bosnian Muslims are very moderate in their beliefs and in their behavior. In Kosovo, frankly, I used to describe it as the most godless country I had ever visited.
Until you went to Albania.
Well, Albania, well, I'm not as familiar with Albania, to tell you the truth. And I used to say I had never met a Kosovar who'd been in the mosque to pray, but then I met the Mufti, so I couldn't say that anymore. The point is that religion has very little traction in Kosovo or in Albania, and a little bit more in Macedonia, I would say. But, you know, it's not only Islam that has more traction, it's also Catholicism because of Mother Teresa that has a little bit more traction inside Macedonia. But these are not very religious countries, and the number of Salafi jihadi types in these countries is actually very, very small. If it weren't for the international scene, I'd be much more concerned about corruption and organized crime than I would be about the Salafi jihadi element.
I also wonder about these percentages. I've heard this as well, that a larger percentage, but then if you look at the percentage of Muslims in West European countries that are more likely to turn to Salafism, I think it's greater than it is in the Balkans.
Yeah, I don't know if it's entirely fair to look at only the Muslim population. Certainly in the United States, the kinds of politically motivated, violent attacks that we've had are not mainly by Muslims. They're mainly by Christians.
Let me turn actually to, we've got a few minutes left on one of the subjects that I've been working on quite a good deal in recent years, and you mentioned it at the outset, and that's the Russian role in the Balkans. We've had threats against NATO enlargement from Moscow. We've had negative propaganda and disinformation against different politicians in the region. We've had attempts to control energy and other major resources, or gain control of major resources in the region, and support for some of the nationalist groupings in Serbia and Montenegro, support for Dodik, for example, in Bosnia and so forth. Do you see a sort of Russian strategy or a Russian plan for the region, or is this simply trying to spoil things for the West?
I think the plan is to spoil things for the West. And I think it's part of a broader perspective, not just about the Balkans. It's about Ukraine, it's about Georgia. This is Putin's Russia, not Yeltsin's Russia. And Russians feel good about Putin's Russia because he's restored Russian pride, and part of the restoration of Russian pride has been standing up to the United States and what are portrayed in Russia as NATO intentions to undermine Russia and to attack Russia. I don't think anybody in the United States wants to be attacking Russia or even undermining Russia, but they do want to be responding to what they see as Russian troublemaking in Ukraine, in the Balkans, in the Caucasus, even in the Baltics. NATO has to stand up to this, and it has to stand up to it by inviting Montenegro to join. It's my hope that someday Sweden and Finland will bite the bullet and decide that they really do need NATO to face down the Russians. I think, you know, Macedonia would clearly like to join NATO. It may have disqualified itself momentarily with its current wiretapping scandal and that kind of thing, but it's qualified in a military sense. It may not meet all the criteria of rule of law and democracy, but it has developed a military that can fight fully integrated with NATO forces, and it can fight as well. It's not just a peacekeeping force. I hope to see Bosnia making the same choice, especially getting a membership action plan, but that requires political will. And the will of the military people is absolutely clear at this point in Bosnia. They want the membership action plan. It's being held up because of Dodik's ambitions for a fully autonomous Republika Srpska, which is an unacceptable outcome for NATO. So, you know, I think there are good prospects to make the Balkans a place where Russia does not get its way.
Because not only in the Balkans, but also in Western Europe, some of the more extreme, either ultra-nationalist or xenophobic, anti-immigrant parties, and sometimes on both sides of the divide. They can fund parties that may be in conflict with each other, but it serves their purposes to have that conflict. How can this be prevented, or let's say better monitored, better deterred in the Balkans?
It's difficult. I think transparency is the main weapon. That, you know, revealing where this money flows, how it flows, who's benefiting from it, is the main thing. You know, the West is a little bit handicapped in this respect because our funding of NGOs in Russia and elsewhere has always been pretty transparent. There have been moments when we made some feeble efforts to hide where the money was going, but frankly everybody knows who gets money from the United States, who gets money from the European Union. We generally publish the grants. There may be a few places where there's a feeble attempt to hide it a little bit, but really that isn't our approach. The Russians are trying to hide it, and it seems to me the best way of countering it is to make it public.
Well, let me ask you a very last question, as we don't have much time. The United States' role in the region. I keep hearing that the US is disengaged, that the level of interest, the level of commitment isn't there anymore. It's waned over the past few years, particularly under the Obama administration. Part of it, I suppose, is because the EU has taken more of the responsibility. I mean, the main, let's say, show in town is the European Union. That's where they're going. But how would you assess now the US commitment to the region? Something I'm always asked, let's say, in Tirana or Pristina.
Well, I think the U.S. has disengaged quite intentionally. There's been a policy for a number of years now of turning things over as much as possible to the European Union, partly because this is Europe, partly because the European Union has many more instruments of leverage than the United States has. Right. I think there remains, however, a kind of American fail-safe. That is, the United States will not allow the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Bosnia and Herzegovina, for example, to be ruptured by a referendum on its court system, for example. I think in Kosovo, the United States will not allow what Vetfendosje would like, which is union with Albania. We're just not in that game. And if we were to go in that direction right now, look at the dominoes that would fall. Look at the situation in Ukraine, for example, where American interests are much greater, European interests are much greater. We certainly wouldn't want to set a precedent for partition, ethnically based partition in the Balkans that would aid the rebels in Ukraine. So I think you've got a pretty strong U.S. fail-safe. You've also got there's some considerable engagement by the U.S. in supporting the European efforts, the talks between Belgrade and Kosovo, for example, and also the European efforts right now with the reform package in Bosnia, where the Americans would like to go a little farther than the current reform package, but they'll back the current reform package, I suspect, in ways that will prove absolutely vital to it. So you do have some American engagement in support of the Europeans in addition to the fail-safe mechanism.
I mean, is there a close policy approach by the two? Do you see any differences between EU and US?
You know, the EU and American diplomats always say there's no daylight between them. But of course there is daylight between them, and that daylight is not on the big issues of do the Balkans countries belong in NATO or the EU? Those are all agreed things. It's not even on the analysis of the current situation. They all agree that Bosnia is stagnating, that Kosovo is having very serious problems. It's on how you deal with these things, what you do between now and ultimate NATO and EU membership. And the Europeans take a much more hands-off approach than the Americans do, and the Americans have to occasionally take a back seat to that hands-off approach. You know, it's very different from the period between '97 and 2006 when the Europeans and the Americans were really close together on implementation of the Dayton Accords, for example. You don't have that same feeling in Kosovo or even in Bosnia today.
Dan Sower, Johns Hopkins, SAIS, Washington, D.C., thank you very much for joining me on the show. And I know you're off to the region, but I'm sure we'll have you back at some future date.
My pleasure, Jan.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of today's show. I have greatly enjoyed being with you and my colleagues both at VOA and at RTK. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. See you all very soon. Miro Pavshim.